All good things must come to an end, and everybody has to rebuild sometime. Whether things just aren't clicking for your team or you've made your run and you're starting to look towards the future, Zach and I got you covered. As always, I do hope y'all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. What strategies do you implement when you're rebuilding in your leagues? But hey, with all that said, let's get right to the content you came for. So Zach, we're back for a very exciting episode today. We're diving into some rebuilding strategy, taking an in-depth look at how we approach our rebuilds. How do we approach a rebuild after we decided it's time to take that step? How do we build around and evaluate each position? How do we identify pieces we want to build around? What makes a player worth building around? And if we're moving assets, what are we looking to get in return? So let's start off right off the rip. Zach, kicking it to you. How do you approach the very start of your rebuild when you decide, hey man, I need to rebuild? Walk me through your first steps in approaching your rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, the first things first, and we've talked about this in some of our other Dynasty videos, is know the league, know the scoring format, know if there are certain positions that hold more value. Say super flex, quarterbacks mean a lot. Single quarterbacks don't mean a whole lot. So it's really important to know your scoring, but then take a look at your roster, identify which players you think you want to build around. I wouldn't say have a few players, depending on the roster contract, of course, have a few players that you wouldn't trade, but have a few players that you plan to build around, and it would take an over-the-moon type of offer to convince you to move off. So I take a look at the roster. I see what on this roster fits well with the scoring of the league. What can I possibly build around, and what would hold value to others? Let me look at the top 6 teams in the league, and let me see their rosters and what are they lacking at, or what do they have a major injury at that I may be able to facilitate in a trade for, say, younger players or draft picks moving ahead. So it's really identifying what in your roster fits well with the league, but also what on your roster fits well on other teams that you could start a trade negotiation with.
Awesome. All great points. And, for me, I'm going to touch on some of that as well and reemphasize. But for me, this is a chance to start over. And you can say, duh, obviously you're rebuilding, you're looking to start over. But let's say it's not just because you have players that are getting older, because I think that's a handful of rebuilds. But I think some teams are just kind of constructed poorly from the jump, which is something you kind of touched on. And I've done this especially when I started Dynasty. One of my big mistakes, I would say, right off the rip, was just not building very well within the league settings, the league formats, things like that. When I was in super flex leagues, I wasn't focusing enough on quarterbacks, or I was focusing too much on quarterbacks. Take your pick. And that's hard to do in a super flex, but I managed when I was still very new to Dynasty. Or, completely neglecting tight ends and a tight end premium. But this is a chance to look at things with hindsight, like you mentioned, and kind of restructure how you work things. Look at the teams to see not only what they need for trade assets and things like that, but also maybe what you can kind of do to mirror your team going forward. Maybe see why those teams are the way that they are. Obviously, they have players that are scoring a lot of points, but you can kind of maybe get a gauge on where the best players sit on their team and how they sit in their lineup. I think all are great things, but look at it with hindsight, like I said, and be able to rebuild not only accordingly around players, but just to really be paying attention to those league settings and things like that going forward, so you can build the best roster possible that's conducive to that league scoring settings, starting rosters, and things like that. I think would be my biggest things to look at right off the rip. And Zach, how do we build around or look to evaluate each position? What position do we prioritize, if any? I think I know where we're going a little bit with this, just looking back on the previous discussion, but what position do you want to prioritize building around in a rebuild?
I think the real important thing is to know next year's draft class. Know what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the draft class, and not even just 1 year. What are the next 2 years of draft classes looking like? It's very hard to project specifically what 2 years is going to look like, but you can get an idea, right? We knew last year at this point that it was not going to be a good quarterback class, and it was going to be a very good wide receiver class. At this point last year, Bob, we knew that about the 2022 draft class. What are we saying now about the 2023 draft class? Running backs, quarterbacks, not very many tight ends, and there's a couple of wide receivers. So that's how I want to frame the construction of my roster and its needs moving forward. I want to have needs at the position of strengths in the draft. So, hypothetically, let's say last year I traded for a back end of the first round pick. I better not be needing running back last year at the end of the first round. Now, Dameon Pierce ended up working out so far, but you just didn't want to be. And look, it's still early to say that the Houston Texans are full on board with Dameon Pierce as the RB1. Like, they could just go next year and draft another running back. They have plenty of picks via the Deshaun Watson trade to address whatever position they want. You don't want to be in a position where you have those assets you need. You have first round picks and you're picking positions that are not strengths in the draft. So next year, I really wouldn't want to need a tight end. And unless I'm getting one of the first 2 or 3 wide receivers right now, there may be other guys we identify later. I would not be wanting to need wide receiver right now. So that's really how I mirror my roster is I want to need what is good in the draft next year.
I think that's an awesome point. And this is something you've touched on a couple times in the past. And I think that's such a good, way to kind of build your draft capital pool for going forward. And it's always awesome to have rookie picks, but it's also awesome to have rookie picks where you have a ton in a draft you have a lot of needs in, where you can actually fill those needs and build your team on going forward. Always definitely a benefit. But for me, looking at how I evaluate positions and, building around everything I got going on. If it's super flex, obviously I want to build around quarterback. Next up for me is tight end. And this is something that actually it has been a bit of a philosophy change for me going forward in this season is I want to have a stud quarterback. And this year is really showing that because the quarterback play outside of like the top 5 or 6 options has just been not good. I mean, the offensive scoring and fantasy points are down a ton so far to start this year, but I want to build my teams around a strong quarterback and a strong tight end. And you've seen this in one league, our Rewinders vs. Patrons League. I made the move to go get the Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews stack. That's done very well for me so far. And so I really want to nail down those 2 positions, because they tend to have so much longevity. I mean, when you can get a young quarterback that's a stud, like a Lamar Jackson, like a Josh Allen, even these guys who aren't really performing well, like a Joe Burrow and a Justin Herbert, guys who have kind of been hit or miss to start the season. When you can get that stack and then start to look at other rooms, then I look at wide receiver because again, we have the longevity there where I can start drafting guys and they're good for 5-6 years. Whereas running backs, once they're good, you maybe have 2 to 3 really good years out of them. And then you kind of have that, RB2 type, RB3, maybe type ranges. But that's kind of how I want to stagger out my build. And, when I'm targeting tight end, like right now, if you're heading into a rebuild, can you buy low on Kyle Pitts right now? A guy who has had his value just plummet through the first third of the season. If you can buy low on him in a rebuild, and I mean, buying low is still going to be a high value. You're not going to get him for a first and, Tyler Higbee or anything like that. You're going to have to pay up still and probably send a couple firsts. And if they're early first, that's obviously not ideal. But if you can send a somewhat competitive tight end, if that team happens to be competing, and then maybe a late first if you happen to have one kicking around, and then maybe another auxiliary running back that you don't need on your team going forward, awesome. His situation right now sucks, but if you're looking down the road and you can secure what is more than likely at some point going to be the best tight end in Dynasty Fantasy Football, man, that's what I'm going to do. Like I said, then running back room, last room I focus on. And at least at that point, I like to think if you have a really full roster outside of running back going into when you start, really targeting running backs, they don't have to be as high end of starters. You can get guys at better value and things like that. And it doesn't have to be as much of a necessity to have a high end running back. Doesn't mean don't get one if you have one fall into your lap. Like if you happen to have the 101, 102 in a draft, don't pass up on running back just because. Either look to trade down or draft the running back, trading for exponentially more later.
Yeah, running back is such a tough situation. And I hear what you're saying. Like I'm looking at Ezekiel Elliott, who we talked about before the season, and I was convinced that, and I'm still not completely off the train, but he's having that RB3 season right now. Maybe things will change, once the offense gets back to normal. But running backs, I try to have one running back that I can just plug and play and never worry about. And I try to have that running back's handcuff as well, because that just gives me security of like, hey, I have this backfield no matter what. That's pretty much my plan on every single dynasty I have, because if you're in a spot where you need to acquire a running back, it's a spot where you're going to have to overpay to, especially mid-season when everybody needs a running back. So I try to do that in terms of my position, but let's just look at last year again. We talked about last year's draft class. I was making sure last year that I needed wide receiver. It's a matter of, for me, framing your team around what's going to be the strengths and the weaknesses of the draft next year, and then go on from there. Tight end and quarterback really depend on the league scoring. If those are a featured league, tight end premium. We have a league, Bob, that's a 2-point per catch tight end premium, or I'm in some leagues where it's start 2 tight ends. Like that really needs to be the focus of your team build. Identifying how you can fill in those blanks on your roster in terms of the strengths and weaknesses, whether that be the draft, whether that be a trades. Who has what team is competing that has a young running back that they have no use for this season, that you could offer them something of use for them. Maybe they had a quarterback go down with injury. Maybe they had a tight end go down with injury, and you have a Travis Kelce on your team. You have a Zach Ertz on your team. That's not going to help you in 2 or 3 years when your team is hopefully full on board with the momentum that you've created with this rebuild. So it is really kind of like a chess game at the end of the day as to how you want to maneuver your pieces. But a lot of that depends on the draft class, which we've talked about, but a lot of it depends on other team constructs too. Identifying what do the top 4 or 5 teams in the league need to cement themselves as a playoff team, to put themselves over the top, and what is it that you have that they may want.
Definitely agree with all that. And the last thing I just didn't get it quite to fill out my point on, being a super flex, I want to build around a top tier quarterback. However, those are going to be very, very expensive to try to acquire via trade. So this is something I'm more than likely going to focus on in a rookie draft, as opposed to trying to trade for them, because I mean, even for guys like, Jalen Hurts, who are just kind of coming up into that top mold, those guys are even getting pretty expensive for my liking. So I am going to try my best to draft them as opposed to trading for them, because it's just going to be exponentially cheaper for me. Now, moving on to the next little bit, we got, how do we identify pieces that we want to build around? We kind of touched on it already. We refer to them frequently on the channel as core players. What makes a player worth building around in Dynasty for you, Zach?
I've said this before, and I really do believe in this philosophy here. And it's, this is supposed to be fun. Unless it's $100, $150, $200 league. Most of your leagues are $10, $20, but this is supposed to be fun. And for me, I try to identify players that I personally like. Sometimes it doesn't work with where they're drafted. I'll give you an example. Alec Pierce was my guy before the draft. I'm like, this guy I'm going to draft in every league possible, no matter the landing spot. And then he lands on the Colts, and I don't really like the landing spot, because I don't see a window in the next 2-3, and I could be wrong. I don't see a window in the next 2-3 years where Alec Pierce is a top 24 wide receiver with Michael Pittman and either Matt Ryan or a young quarterback they draft in 2023. I still went out and got Alec Pierce everywhere, and I'm feeling good about it now. He's had a couple of good weeks. So, for me, it's what players do I actually like in real life? And that is a little bit of scouting, a little bit of homework. And I don't scout, but you know what I do? I tune into what you guys say, because you guys do the scouting for me, and I trust you guys. And that's why I wanted to be on this channel, because I like the work that you guys do. So, do the research yourself, or listen to somebody you trust that does, and find guys that you like and go get them. And that's the draft philosophy of it. If you're going to trade for players, I am not the overspender. I will not overspend on a trade unless I just flat out lost the trade, when you look at a trade back in hindsight. But in the present moment, I'm never an overspender, because and we've talked about this before, that is how you set your rebuild back. We're talking about being in a rebuild scenario. We're not talking about a championship window. We're talking about a team that has admitted this is not working. I need to take the necessary steps to fix this and get this team competitive in the next 2 years. And by overspending on a player, you don't know what can happen. You can have an injury. You can have a player, fall over the cliff. And I just don't. That is how you set yourself. Like, those 2 years are now out the window because you've overspent on a player that is not contributing to your rebuilding roster. So I never do that. And I look for players I can buy low on. You talked about Kyle Pitts last year. A great example was Amon-Ra St. Brown. Nobody wanted Amon-Ra St. Brown after the first 10 weeks of the season. I acquired Amon-Ra St. Brown for 2 fourth-round picks in one league. I'm feeling pretty good about that one today. So what players can you do that for now? It's tough this year. I'm looking at the wide receivers specifically. There's been a pretty big gap in terms of the rookies that were drafted this year that are contributing to the ones that aren't. Like Rachaad White's not really contributing. But what's really Rachaad White's ceiling? It's really dependent on Leonard Fournette, who just signed a 3-year contract. So it's a little bit different this year than it was last year, but maybe there are more Kyle Pitts out there, other players that you can buy low on that you may like that fit your 2, 3, 4 year rebuild window. I like Brandon Cooks. I'm not trying to acquire Brandon Cooks on a rebuilding team because by the time I'm competitive, he's 30, 31 years old. What other players can you identify to buy low? Maybe it's a Trevor Lawrence. Maybe it's a couple weeks ago it was Travis Etienne. Now Travis Etienne is starting to get the larger chunk of opportunities in that offense. So what players are not contributing now that you may think contribute at the end of the season or even next year? This is a long-term outlook. This is not a redraft thing. This is, how does this player look next year? Does this maybe Drake London is a good example. Atlanta's not a pass-heavy team. They are running the ball and it's semi-working. Yep. You look at a couple of weeks ago, Atlanta threw the ball 14 total times. That's not good for Drake London. If I'm the Drake London owner, I'm upset. But I'm looking at a scenario where Atlanta's probably going to draft a quarterback in the first round. And I would bank on that. I would bet my money on that because it's a really good quarterback draft class. And Marcus Mariota sucks to the point where they don't trust him to throw. And they're not putting Desmond Ridder out there. So, Desmond Ridder's not going to hold them back from drafting a quarterback in the first round. So take a look at what players are in opportunities that could change in 2023. Can Drake London and Kyle Pitts both be in an offense that throws instead of 15 times a game, 30 times a game next year? And maybe you have that opportunity to buy low. Again, I think it's a little bit too early for that. That's more of a week 10 through whatever your trade deadline window is. And those, you have to hope for a continuation of a lack of usage for Drake London and Kyle Pitts and whatever player it is. Because if Drake London all of a sudden comes out and catches 20 catches, that's not good for you trying to buy low. So you have to hope that decreased production continues. You want a solid 10 weeks of that so you can try to buy low.
I can definitely agree with that. For me, and you touched on this, and I love the point of, you can like Brandon Cooks as much as you want. You can like Mike Evans as much as you want. Maybe somebody who's a little better, who's contributing a little more. The fact of the matter is, how long is this rebuild going to take? You need to take that into consideration because obviously younger players are going to be your preferred, but that doesn't mean you have to move anybody over the age of 24. And that doesn't mean you can't acquire anybody that's around age 26. Running backs, maybe, seeing that they have the shortest shelf life, but wide receivers can remain pretty viable up to age 28. Quarterbacks, tight ends, well into their 30s. How long do you believe this is going to take? And add that many years onto the players on your team, who's looking to age out or who's getting close to it. Also keeping in mind how much those players' values are going to fall over that span as well. Because if, he might be valuable or viable come his age 27 season, but if he's not worth anything to you really at that point, you may as well look to move him now as opposed to later if he's really not giving the same kind of production. For me, identifying core players is as much about identifying as who I do not want to build around as much as the players I do want to build around. What players are just going to be too old and not very viable by the time I'm supposed to come out of my rebuild. Most rebuilds should take 2 years. It shouldn't be much more than that. Especially unless you just wait till the absolute second to move on from anybody, any aging asset, and you're not getting any value off them, where you're only getting like second round picks and you're not able to get first round picks or prospects in return. It shouldn't take more than 2 years. The ideal plan, I think, is 2 years. Sometimes you can turn around in one. Chev and I have both turned around a rebuild in an off season. So that's pretty cool. But I'd say that's very rare cases. And I would say both of us got very lucky with that and won a championship in the same year. So now that we're, we've kind of established the core players we want to build around, now we're looking to move players. If we're moving assets, what do we look to get in return? Do we have a preference between picks, players? Do we want to make sure we're getting both? Zach, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I know the rule that you're going to say, so I'm not going to steal it. I'm going to let you have that one because it's a phenomenal point, and I have been using that ever since I heard you say that first. But for me, it's remember, if you've been watching the Flannel Panel shows in the past, I always use the word finesse. I'm a trade finesser. I like to smooth talk and this and that. And I just like to talk in general. That's just who I am. That's why you guys brought me on, really. And when somebody asks me, what do I want? Because again, I'm about the trade dialogue. I'm not the send the offer, no trade dialogue around. That very rarely happens. I'm the kind that you can send me an offer, and even if I'm going to reject it, I'm going to talk to you about it. I like to have that dialogue no matter what it is. Typically what happens is when I'm in a rebuilding situation, somebody's asking me, what do I want? And I say, and I'm lying, I want picks or young players. If I wanted a young player, I would have made an attempt to go get them in the past. I want picks. I always want picks because draft picks do not lose value the closer you get to the draft. When the draft clock starts, they gain value. The more and more they get closer to that specific pick, these picks never lose value. I always want draft picks. Now, there may be a player or two I'm generally interested, but more often than not, I want the draft picks because they're going to gain value. I may use those draft picks. I may trade those draft picks in the offseason when we get closer, when those draft picks, the philosophy around those picks moves from they don't score me points to they can get me players who will score me points. Because right now, draft picks they don't score you points. That's 1,000% fact. But in the offseason, when football's over, and when the difference between champions and losers in Dynasty Fantasy Football is made, those draft picks increase in value, sometimes 2 or 3-fold. Like right now, third round pick is nothing. It's nothing. But when you get to the third round and you've got the 302 and somebody wants to move up 5 spots, they may give you a second round pick next year straight up just for the pick. So I always want draft picks because they increase in value. And people go out of their minds the closer they get to the draft. And then when you're on the clock, I mean, again, they just never lose value. They never will. And the closer you get to the draft, the more valuable they become. So I always want draft picks back in a trade.
I think that's awesome. I always usually target a pick for sure. I'm a big fan of, and as you alluded to, my number one tip with this is always get multiple assets in return. Anytime you're moving a guy like a Davante Adams or, a Mike Evans, any of these players, and I've seen this in the comments all the time, and I always say, get something else on top. Get something more on top of that first round pick. Because the way I see it is if you're moving Davante Adams for a first round pick, who's probably going to be a good player, great player. We don't know that for sure, especially if it's a late round pick. You never know. They might be a bust. Who knows? But I always see it as even though you're getting more time on that player, which is like the perceived bonus of that pick value, it's still a lateral move asset wise. In the terms of overall just assets on your team, it's a 1-for-1 deal. And that's why I very rarely will ever send a 1-for-1 trade. Even going out, I always try to get multiple assets coming back because then I add to my player pool add to my asset pool as opposed to diluting it. But I very rarely send a trade like that unless I'm basically trying to just get out on a player and be done. My most recent one is this last weekend. I sent Tyler Lockett for a late second round pick next year. That was like the most recent 1-for-1 trade I've done in a hot minute. And I mean like a hot minute. Otherwise, it's always, some type of package one way or the other. But I always want to get multiple assets in return, especially when you're moving that great win now asset, like a Davante Adams, for example. Buy in on assets that could see a value or production increase. As much as I hate to say it, I was pretty big in on Elijah Moore coming into the year. Just a guy who hasn't panned out. I mean, just an afterthought in this offense. He's a guy you could look to buy in on now. It's kind of risky because, yes, we've seen some production when he's gotten the work. but so have we with like Greg Dortch. It's kind of one of those things where it's kind of a scary comparison when you look at that, but you don't want to buy in on depreciating and aging assets when you're looking to get picks in return when you're in that rebuild. Always aim to target a pick and a pro prospect. I like to target the prospect as well because of the fact of the matter that you already have a player that's kind of already cooking in the league, as opposed to having to wait another year to draft a player, having to wait 2 years to draft a player if it's 2024. But I don't mind that. It's just if they happen, and I'm not going to just throw in a random, wide receiver rookie that I don't really like. I'm not going to do that. Like, that's just kind of silly to me. If they don't have an asset I like, I'm just going to roll with the picks. I'm just going to take the multiple picks, call it a day. That's what I'm going to do with that. But I always want to get picks and a prospect or multiple picks. I never want to leave a trade or, move an asset one for one. I really just hate doing that. There's just something fundamentally in my brain and in my soul that I do not want to move a one for one asset unless I'm just willing to cut bait on a player. If I'm going to end up cutting that player at some point in the near future anyway, see ya. I'll do the one for one like I did with Tyler Lockett, who I'm not cutting this year by any stretch, but next year, man, his value is going to be even further in the tank.
No, I knew that's where you were going to go, Bob, and I didn't want to pull that from you. But I did want to ask, we're getting to the point now where we're in leagues with people who watch these videos and who take that advice. So, like, where do you draw the line? Say, I understand sometimes you're just asking for a throw-in pick, like a 4th round pick. Like, where do you draw the line and say, all right, I'll just take the one for one? Because I did something similar. I took I actually took over an orphan team in the middle of the week last week. Absentee owner, they need somebody to fill in. The year is free, and so I'm gutting the roster, and somebody offers me just a straight up 2nd round pick for DeAndre Hopkins, and I'm like, that's a fair deal, man. I'm going to take that. I'm going to take that. So where do you draw the line specifically between, because sometimes people are just like in poker, they're calling your whatever it is. I don't know they're calling your bluff. There you go. Thank you for that. I don't know why I didn't know that, but Jake, when is it that you say I want multiple assets for this pick, or I'll just take a one-on-one for this trade?
So how I do this is twofold. To answer the part where you mentioned, like, we're in leagues with players who want to administer the same strategy. What I do there is kind of that when you have so many people are selling, that's when you kind of start buying, and vice versa. When you have a lot of people that are buying up on, let's say for whatever example, CeeDee Lamb, they want to buy him for an exponential value than what he's worth. That's when you turn into a seller if you have them, because you're getting exponential value back. It's kind of one of those cases where now if everybody's willing to take 2 assets for one piece and they're just trying to, do that in every trade, you can kind of get more trades done just using that strategy that way. But to touch on the other point of, like, when you just kind of admit, hey, enough's enough, this is more than worth value for that player, which I think for DeAndre Hopkins, a 2nd is awesome value. And if I have DeAndre Hopkins on a couple rosters, and if somebody offered me a 2nd round pick, I'd probably be like, okay, dude, you can have him. It is one of those things where, especially with an aging asset like that, or an asset that you just really want to get off your team because you don't believe in them long-term or whatever the case is, you do need to look at it as just, it's a matter of, you could maybe get 2/3 for him if you wanted to go multiple assets, but I'd rather have the 2nd round pick.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, if you were to try to get multiple assets, what are you getting? And would you rather have that over the 2nd round pick? It's kind of like that 2 in the hand versus 1 in the bush, or 1 in the hand versus 2 in the bush is how that saying actually goes. Do you want that better pick, and just have one of them? That's kind of how I differentiate and how I do that in my head. It comes to a point where it's just, this is fair value. I'm not going to go crazy trying to get, 3 fab on top or anything like that, or anything crazy. I'm going to get the deal done, move on with my team. Now that space opens up a spot where I can stash a player. Maybe I was looking to move a player off my IR or my taxi squad, whatever the case is. That is how I would break that down. And I don't know if that answers your question enough. I hope it does.
For the most part, when it's one of those veteran players that literally just serves your roster no purpose, you'll take a 1 for 1. But if you're trading something that somebody really wants, you can ask for it. Because it's kind of, the question really is like, what can you get away with asking? Because at some point, you're going to turn somebody off at some point. You're going to turn somebody off if you keep asking and asking for too much. So I guess it's just tricky when, if I want to trade with you, Bob, I know what you want. and you know what I'm going to do. So we know how each other work,
Moving on to the last bit I have, question wise, how do things change for us if we're rebuilding an aging team versus one that just hasn't panned out for any reason? Maybe it didn't, take off due to the league settings. Maybe we just didn't build properly. Does anything change, versus a team that maybe needs to be retooled, team that needs to be completely just torn down and rebuild because aging team? How do things change for you when looking through these two different lenses, Zach? Because I think there are different rebuilds in that. Like I said, the aging team is probably one of the more common ones, but there are teams that just, whether it's because of a bad draft, things just don't really pan out. How are you attacking these two separate scenarios?
Yeah, I actually have a situation like this, and it was a scenario where I probably shouldn't have tried to go for it. And I acquired some older players that haven't panned out for me, like Allen Robinson, like Ezekiel Elliott. And, I just don't foresee that changing too much. I don't, maybe they get a little bit better, but I don't see it changing to the point where it makes my 1-5 or 1-6 or 2-5 team, whatever that may be, into a team that, maybe I can squeak it to the playoffs, but I don't think it's going to help me. So you have to realize when the jig is up. That's the first thing. When the jig is up with your team, is this team underperforming because of injuries? Is this team underperforming because of age, which is really what the question is asking? Sometimes you got to take the L on the trade and say, all right, I might have acquired this player for a first round pick. Can I get a second round pick back? And sometimes that's tough to do because you're admitting that you failed in a trade before. And I did that with Ezekiel Elliott. The offense hasn't been running long enough how it wants to look. Like we've seen Dak for 1 or 2 weeks now at this point. So I'm not completely off the Ezekiel Elliott ship. But if I want to be able to save my team, like I don't want to be holding Ezekiel Elliott into the offseason on a team that's going to be picking top 5 in the NFL or in the rookie draft. I want to see if I can get the most value for Zeke now to a team that, let's say, maybe week 10 or week 11, they sustain an injury to a running back, and Zeke for a second and a third is something I can pull off. I probably will. So, I have to identify the players on my team that can help me moving forward next year, because I don't see Ezekiel Elliott next year being a whole lot better than however he finishes this year. Look, I still believe in Ezekiel Elliott. I don't know if I believe him being an RB1 anymore, which is what I said before the season. I'm not right on everything. Some things I'm wrong. It happens. But there's still value in Elliott to be had in a trade to somebody else. You're probably not going to get that first round pick back, but you can save a second and a third round pick, which you can turn into another running back. So it's really just looking at your roster and saying, are these players going to be able to help me when I'm supposedly turning this thing around? And I don't want to overshadow the comment I made earlier. Is like I made a decision on a certain roster to try to compete, and it wasn't ready to. And you have to be able to quickly identify that you messed up, because if you wait until other owners have made trades and sent away their first and second round picks, and the ones, there are certain leagues where one team has 5 first round picks already. Those are the first round picks of the 5 of the top 6 teams. So those teams no longer have a first round pick to trade to me now in a team that's selling. So, we've talked about it before, the timing of the trade, but just, having recognition of your overall roster and its place in the league in a year or two. And can I compete with this? Can these players help me? And if not, who can they help in the league now?
The way I look at it is all rebuilds are unique, and you're going to, you're always going to have different players on your roster. There's just not really many cases where all my teams are really built the same, especially when I have to go into that rebuild, because everybody ages out differently. You usually should not have the same exact players on every single roster across your leagues. You should try to have a diverse portfolio across your leagues. Just off the off chance that, if you had Javonte Williams and Trey Lance on all of your rosters this year, you're already in pretty bad spot. So not great there, but all rebuilds are unique. But if anything else, this does kind of change how I might go about the order in which I decide to rebuild every position group. If I'm still young and strong in certain areas for a few years, I might try to finish that room first, despite it not typically being first on my list. Outside of running backs, I'm usually trying to move and flip that room out and, make that my last room of focus. And especially because you can usually get the most for running backs, especially in your league. So it's one of those things where I'm going to try to do that. If it's an aging roster, I'm just sticking to my typical process, figure out the quarterback. Maybe that's something I can address in the upcoming draft. If not, maybe I can buy one low now, kick the tires on guys like Justin Herbert. But otherwise, I'm more than likely just trying to draft that quarterback because it's going to be significantly cheaper. Then look at tight end. What can I do there? Can I add Mark Andrews, who I still think is going to be viable for another 4 or 5 years at the tight end 1 spot in Dynasty? Yes, I know Kyle Pitts is a thing, but I still feel very strongly about where Mark Andrews is in terms of production and his actual value amongst tight end 1 Dynasty. But then I'm going to look at wide receiver again. Maybe I already flushed out that room because I had a strong room to build around that's already young. But then lastly, again, turn my focus to the running back room because they have the least amount of tread on the tires. They have the least amount of, run, pun intended, in the league in terms of how long they're viable, just because they take so much damage. A lot of these guys get used up for their rookie contracts and then they're kind of just tossed to the wind, which is super unfortunate. It happens, but it is one of those things where they just have the least amount of viability long-term especially when it comes to high-end production. After that first contract, you might get guys that perform reasonably well and are still valuable and are worth throwing into a starting lineup, but they're just not the same guys they were when they were on that first contract in the first few years of the league, when they're in that prime window, ages 22, 23 to 25, 26 is usually when we kind of see running backs start to tail off. That's the only thing that really changes for me. Otherwise, I'm, kind of sticking to the same way, regardless of how I get there. It's just a matter of, if anything, maybe I choose to build the rooms out a little differently than I would if it was just a bog standard. This team is old. I need to tear things down versus a team that just hasn't panned out. And then you also, again, like we mentioned earlier in the video, it's a chance for a second start, a new beginning to tear it all down and build it back right, as opposed with what you know now with hindsight, which is so valuable, as opposed to having to, maybe you're unfamiliar with these league settings. You don't know how a tight end premium league is going to shake out with tight end scoring. And it's one of those things where I'd highly recommend, if you're on Sleeper, you can go back and look at the league settings where these guys finished last year in terms of overall scoring. You can filter the stats before the draft to see where people panned out, and you can kind of do that to figure it out and help with those situations where you might be unfamiliar with the league settings you're dealing with. Well, that is it for today's video. I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. What rebuilding strategies do you implement in your leagues, and what did you learn today in this video? What other questions do you have when it comes to a rebuild? If you couldn't tell, rebuilding isn't easy as is, but it's even harder when you can't get out of your own way and you're making very common avoidable mistakes. Be sure to check out the video on your screen now where Nate and I dive into very common avoidable mistakes in Dynasty Fantasy Football rebuilds and how to fix these mistakes going forward. But hey, that's going to be it for us today. We will see y'all in the next one, but until then, y'all have a good one.